So here we are. For this second day, we will first welcome Björn Berg Marklund from the University of Skövde in Sweden. He will talk about improving the future of digital game-based learning by examining the past. The program of the day will mainly about two sessions then with an invited talk, and we will talk about urbanism, politics, and social sciences mainly. So the program will be quite large. Welcome, Björn. I hope you can hear us well.
Yes, hear you perfectly.
Okay, great. Here you go. Please help yourself.
I will start sharing. I'm sorry about that. That should work. Okay, cool. So I hope you can't hear my dog barking in the background, by the way. I apologize if you do. It's like a perfect storm of distractions today. I have builders on the roof and a very new, nervous puppy who's our rescue from the street. Can you hear him? Otherwise, I'll fix my microphone.
Very well.
Okay, cool. I have some tricks up my sleeve. But anyway, right. So thank you very much for having me. My God. Felix, hey.
Obviously, we have a special guest today.
I'm so sorry.
Very heavy one, I suppose.
Cool. Yeah, so again, I apologize and thank you very much for the invite. I always enjoy being here, of course. I enjoy it even more when I can be there in person, but you know, it is what it is. And I want to be extra grateful because you kind of entertained a submission that's perhaps not super common or you know, follows the standard GSGS kind of presentation style. So I'm very appreciative of that too, that you entertained my way of writing and argumentation. So thank you very much for that. So my talk is about improving the future by examining the past. And I guess a subtitle for this could be kind of examining the damaged foundation of digital game-based learning, which sounds a little bit dramatic, and I guess it kind of is, but it's, you know, I'm a theatrical person. Why would we want to examine the past? Well, in my opinion, and from my experience as both a digital game-based learning developer, teacher who's worked with serious games for about a decade at this point, and someone who works a lot with kids and teachers, and who's also a game developer on my own, there are many components of game-based learning that we don't really have paused to properly investigate as a community. We've kind of kept moving forward without really standing still for a while and examining why we're doing the things we do. And without taking the time to investigate, developments in the field might be built on false premises and flawed theories. But it's not just me wanting to talk about things being like all doom and gloom. I think if we do pause to reflect and honestly critique what we're talking about right now, the future of digital game-based learning can be a lot brighter. That's when we get free to be more creative in how we kind of explore what digital game-based learning can be. So a big reason I wanted to write this for GSGS, first and foremost, is that in this community, there are fewer assumptions made that I find in other conferences. I feel like in this community, you very rarely look at technology or digital technologies or games as something that will automatically solve problems. I find that you often place the purpose and your knowledge of a situation and your participants and your beneficiaries, your intimate knowledge with them first before thinking about what kind of game you want to use, or if you even want to use a game at all. And I think a really healthy thing is that you don't just trust that game developers know more than you do about what your participants might enjoy or how you can better work with your kind of stuff. So because of that, I kind of wanted to write a paper that highlights two issues that I consider to be really pressing for the digital game-based learning community, broadly speaking, because I think this would be an interesting place to have that conversation. There are two aspects I cover in the paper. First of all, is the theory aspects of it, which is a flawed and kind of problematic way of discussing learning and students and games currently happening in the community. There's also a big practical component in my paper where I explore these unreasonable expectations we have of how games can work in classrooms, for example, outside of the actual research setting, and the mismatch between education and digital game development. But for today, I'll kind of focus more on the theory part. So this will definitely be a very concept-focused presentation, a lot of talk about theory, and not really a presentation of one of my recent game projects. So that means that there won't be many pictures, but there will be a lot of text. So I apologize for that. And yeah, in this presentation, I will primarily focus on the theory problem. And if there's time in the end, I do have some extra slides, backup slides, if we want to talk about the practicalities. Otherwise, you'll find that stuff in my paper. So I'm going to focus on the biggest and most persistent problematic concept in digital game-based learning discussions, which is the digital native and digital immigrant division. So what do these terms kind of mean? They're kind of fundamental and pretty huge. I think most of you have kind of encountered them once or twice, but we'll talk about where they come from first, of course. So the terms originate from writings by Mark Prensky, primarily. Most of you probably see him like this, you know, as Prensky 2001, Prensky 2003 are citations you encounter very, very often whenever you read digital game-based learning or literature, and actually in a lot of serious games literature in general. And these references point towards either his early writings on digital natives and digital immigrants, where he kind of coins the terms to begin with. And that consists of two parts. It's this first chapter, of course, but then there's also part 2, which is where he makes a different kind of examination of what he thinks the digital native is. And then another really popular citation is his book, Digital Game-Based Learning, who has 2 editions, the latest one being 2003, which is what people usually refer to. So what kind of statements does he produce in these papers? Well, first of all, in these writings, he exclusively focuses on discussing the current generation of learners, the digital natives and the people who are our players or participants. And he makes these kinds of statements in these chapters. And I'm going to be reading a little bit of this. So one claim he makes in part 1 here is that it is now clear that a result of this ubiquitous environment and sheer volume of their interaction with it, today's students think and process information fundamentally differently from their predecessors. He continues to write, as we shall see in the next installment, it is very likely that our students' brains have physically changed and are different from ours. And by ours, he means like the older people reading this kind of thing, which is the immigrant generation, as a result of how they grew up. Okay. So that's kind of his first established theory, let's say. And he continues then to talk about for those raised on traditional educational and training theory, which again is us, the readers, it is important to realize that because this is a discontinuity, which is to say that he is presenting something that isn't established knowledge, let's say, most of the data we have collected and the theories we have formulated in the past about how people think and learn may no longer apply. So that's a very efficient way for Mark Prensky to kind of say that all previous research is completely irrelevant. We can't even look at that anymore because games are so unique that we can't really be looked at through the same lens. So it's kind of an effective way for him to not having to use references in the future, I guess. So that's his kind of stance in the digital native kind of presentation. His books are, of course, expansions of these concepts, but they also talk a lot more about the nature of the games themselves, how you develop a game, what the design principles should be for the games to be good and useful for these digital natives. And I think a very telling kind of example of the tone he uses in these books can be seen in the first chapter, where he compares his experience going to E3, which is the Electronic Entertainment Expo, which is one of the game industry's largest commercial exhibits, where all the major game developers come to show their products, and consumers come there and visit it, not academics, consumers. And he describes it like this. So E3 is packed with realistic looking aliens, giant game characters, Hollywood style effects, scantily clad women, and thousands of exhibitors and attendees. This is fun. This is the entertainment world. These, ladies and gentlemen, are today's trainees. So these are today's players or students, if you want to call it that. So then he contrasts this with the American Society of Trainers and Developers, which of course is a completely different type of conference. And this conference is described like this, in comparison to E3. There is no music, no fancy lights, no noise, no lines, certainly no dancing girls. The energy level is low, maybe 1/50th of that of E3. There are maybe 1/50th of people there as well, mostly in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. And again, he makes a distinction between a digital immigrant pretty much being older than 30 years old. It kind of varies depending on the book you read, but that's his essential stance. If you're older than 30, you don't really understand technology. Anyway, they meander at a glacial speed along straight aisles from tiny booth to tiny booth. And then, this is boring. This is the learning world. These, ladies and gentlemen, are today's trainers. So again, teachers, educators, whatever you want to call them. And you can see a very clear kind of dichotomy, or you can clearly see what his opinion are of the different kind of fields of work, if you want to call it that. Cool. So, but what's the problem with this then? Like, it's just literature, right? It can be written however you want to. Some people write in a more dramatic fashion, some people don't. But the problem kind of emerges here, which is that Mark Prensky's work does not have any sort of scientific backing at all. There's none of it. I think a lot of people in the audience, there's a lot of healthcare professionals here, I know at GSGS, maybe you already reacted to his notions of people's brains physically changing in the period of 20 years because games exist now. So that's not really based on science, of course. Mark Prensky himself is described as an entrepreneur, thought leader, and consultant. So he is not a researcher of any sort, and he doesn't really claim to be. His texts often promote products that are developed at his own companies or his partners' companies, and his texts rarely have any peer-reviewed references and rely primarily on newspaper articles, personal correspondence, and practical business materials. Cool. Now, again, this might not be an issue yet. Okay, it's just at this point kind of bad writing, you could say, at least in my opinion. But the problem, of course, emerges or depends on how impactful this becomes for a field of science. So I had my library conduct because I'm not a librarian, I can't do this as a professional, but do this kind of reference analysis or background check of all his chapters and kind of show where they come from, how often they're cited, and that kind of stuff. So to begin with, the book chapter we're talking about, the Digital Immigrants one, that specific chapter has about 30,000 citations of Google Scholar, which is a lot of citations. Maybe I'm just bitter because I don't have that many, but it's a lot for sure. And furthermore, they did this altmetric kind of analysis, which is a little bit more in-depth and kind of Scopus-like, I would say. And let's zoom in a little bit on the actual text here, right? So according to altmetric, this publication, again, the Digital Immigrants one, has been cited 4,466 times. 34% of its citations have been received in the past 2 years, which is higher than you might expect. Yeah, I agree with that. Compared to other publications in the same field, this publication is extremely highly cited. Extremely, I think that's an interesting way of phrasing it. And has received approximately 1,130 times more citations than your average kind of digital game-based learning paper or whatever paper in this kind of community. I actually think it encompasses all types of computers in education, entertainment in education kind of communities. So it is very popular all over the place. And also here's a easy visualization that it increases fairly rapidly the amount people cite him over time. You can really see that it took off here around the 2010 mark, I would say. And of course, this drop-off doesn't mean that we've completely stopped referencing him. It's just that's where the analytics kind of fall off. And of course, publications usually take a year or two to come out after peer review and all that kind of stuff. So But the latest data point we have around 2019 is about 600 citations that year. So let's see. Oh yeah, I should also add that according to my librarians, the first article here only contains one single reference, and that's a reference to Prensky's own work. So that's not particularly academically sound either. What I want to do here, because again, this is such an impactful piece of work, I think it's really important to kind of know what the origins are, of course, of this work, but also how the most impactful text in the 21st century of digital game-based learning, what it actually sounds like and how it's written. I showed some before, but I'm going to show a little bit more. So you'll get a short audiobook reading, so you can all relax and listen to my soothing narrative voice, I guess. So I'm going to read from, again, this first chapter in the book Digital Game-Based Learning, which is called Fun at Last. And this chapter can be downloaded at his website. I downloaded this yesterday, so it's still up there and not a dated version. So yeah, it's there and you can read it for yourself. But I've extracted one of the parts that I find to be very telling, let's say. So it starts by saying this. The true 21st century learning revolution is that learning, training, and schooling is finally throwing off the shackles of pain and suffering. Within most of our lifetimes, pretty much all learning will become truly learning-centered and fun. The huge wall, which has separated learning and fun, work and play for the last few hundred years, is finally beginning to tremble. And while it will continue to resist for a while yet, like the Berlin Wall in the political world when it finally falls, there will be a stampede to freedom. The reason this will happen, and happen soon, is that learners will demand it to the point that management, teaching, and administrators can no longer resist. Hey. Cool, I have a trick up my sleeve.
Maybe your dog has a special question to point out.
Oh yeah, exactly.
To
he doesn't
the last
agree with
part
me at all.
concerning the reason.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he loves Mark Prensky, so he doesn't like this at all. But yeah, so again, I think that's kind of extreme writing, very dramatic, of course. You can also see that like the chapter title, Fun at Last, is a play on words from Martin Luther King's speech that ends with free at last. And again, he refers to the Berlin Wall as similar to the current state of education. So yeah, he's not really pulling any punches. And by this, he also means that teachers are essentially oppressors of the poor students who are working for their civil rights, essentially. So I don't really read this to just make fun of Mark Prensky, even though I think it's kind of fun to do that. he is not the problem here. The academic community's treatment of his work is the actual problem. A senior academic can't reasonably be reading these original texts and then look at them and interpret them as peer-reviewed research. There's just no way you would do that if you're a senior academic. And that's where the community has kind of failed and fallen apart and not done what a scientific community is supposed to do. And this is not common. It happens in many fields of research, of course, but we can look at it like this. Like one person, of course, is the first person to read Mark Prensky's work, and maybe they like some concepts out of it or something like that. So they cite it or reference it. Maybe researcher B here, the second one, reads this first researcher's paper and thinks like, oh, well, this is a neat concept. I agree with the fact that games are a very engaging way of learning and teaching students new things. Maybe they will check very briefly on the original text to see like if those interesting parts that interest them are actually there. You know, maybe they don't do the entire fact-checking background, but they will at least check it out maybe. And this is where the problem kind of escalates, because now we get the third researcher, and when they have more than one author to point towards, it starts to look like there's a consensus here, that there are more than one person who have like looked at this piece of work and kind of peer reviewed it together. That's how science works, right? More people look at the same thing and kind of examine it, and then a consensus builds and theory builds up over time. So they might cite it as well. You know, it continues that way, and the consensus kind of builds and builds and builds and builds. it becomes easier and easier for people to look at this consensus because it's more and more out there in the world and in papers. And of course, in the end, you reach the point we're currently at, where people can just cite it without really looking at it at all, which is completely understandable, again. So the actual content of the original text doesn't really matter anymore. It's just seen as a universal truth. Mark Prensky, just using that parenthesis, is kind of a shorthand, just to kind of say, as a punctuation mark, to say that digital game-based learning is really good. It's a great idea. I think a large part of why this has happened is because of the interdisciplinary nature of the field of digital game-based learning. Right? We have so many researchers coming from education, coming from entertainment computing, just digital education, e-learning, all that kind of stuff. Some from games, some from serious games. So they don't all have the same kind of toolbox to analyze this language. They're not all game designers, for example, so they might trust Mark Prensky on his word that this is how games work. It's also a very young field of work, so there's a lot of junior researchers here that are particularly susceptible to these issues. Like, it's very hard to find the confidence as a master student or PhD student to look at this huge body of work in the community and disagree with it. And you also don't have time for it when you're writing your thesis. That's like a lot of work to begin with. So this terminology has now become part of the foundation of digital game-based learning. It was always there, like Mark Prensky even coined the term digital game-based learning, and that's what a lot of our community is based around. So you can't really fix that foundation without some really painful discussions at this point. And just to make sure that I'm not just inventing this kind of stuff and that it is still a problem, I attended the European Conference of Game-Based Learning last year. I usually go through proceedings from this conference and just word search digital native, for example, or Mark Prensky or anything like that. And here are just a few of the examples from this particular conference. From this particular conference, right? So it still emerges from time to time, and it's also often the exact same kind of language that gamers are motivated by. These assumptions that younger people or gamers are like very, very into these types of things. You can also say that people say consistent with previous studies, and they throw Prensky in there, even though none of the stuff he's writing about is any sort of study at all. Even if you disregard the scientific rigor of it, he doesn't present anything as a study. It's just an argumentative text. And so forth. I don't have to go through all the examples. Hopefully this is sufficient to tell you that it's not just me inventing things from out of nowhere. But now it's important to kind of discuss whether this actually causes any real problems, because all of these citations and stuff wouldn't be a problem if it was completely harmless and never led to anything. But it kind of does, which is the big problem here. Because if you do start listening to this kind of stuff, which you do, it happens in Swedish educational debates all the time, it leads to us making educational changes or changes in the way we practice pedagogy or fund our schools or whatever, and we adapt that to a completely fictional student that doesn't really exist. They are assumed to be, proficient in all these types of things, but they aren't. They might not even have the interest that Mark Prensky thinks they do. So we make a bunch of materials based on no one that's actually real, or a very, very few people where that description might apply to. Another very important part, which I work with a lot, is the practical part, which purely, simply like believing in these things or listening to this type of rhetoric means that you often redirect important resources towards something that we don't really understand. You will start pursuing something as expensive and complicated as digital games because you've heard about how amazingly promising it is, and that there's an entire scientific field of academics who keep saying that it's very, very important. And again, this is why I appreciate being at GSGS. I feel like you put your intimate knowledge with the participant and the use situation way before you even start talking about, well, games are the absolute best way to doing that. Because what often happens is the complete reverse. People look at how cool games are and kind of try to shoehorn it into different situations that they feel would benefit from it. I think it's way healthier to approach it from the other side of things. So ironically, it's kind of, even though Mark Prensky claims that the current way of teaching and whatever harms students significantly, they're oppressed, and it's very traumatic to be taught anything in the current system. Again, if you know something about your students' need, you will of course start adapting your teaching to help them if you're a teacher. So if you know that your students are digital natives, you will of course adapt your teaching towards what benefits a digital native, again, which is a fictional person. And adapting learning content and teaching processes to people who have an assumed needs and skill set just isn't very good. It's like not examining whether a group of students have high levels of reading, just regular literacy, and making a complete assumption on how well a 6-year-old reads, and then throwing a bunch of like high quality books on them or something. It just doesn't match very well. You assume that they know stuff that they actually don't. Because the reality is with the digital native is that kids just aren't naturally tech or game literate. They aren't even naturally tech or game interested. They aren't. And again, kids are the digital native generation. What Mark is describing is a person that exists, but it's a very specific person who is born into an environment where tech interests are actively nurtured. Like I, for example, was fortunate enough to be born into a family who were super tech interested and had a computer very early on when they costed like 2,000 euros or whatever. My interest was nurtured from a very early age. That doesn't happen to everyone. There are socioeconomic circumstances beyond that affect how often a person can access a computer and kind of build up this literacy and interest. Access to technologies in general, like broadband connections or internet connectivity, is not universal yet. And of course, a big component of it is the more invisible one, which is social norms. Like some people just aren't invited into the game community, let's say, or it's not easy for them to start playing and being accepted into things. Like I don't have to go into that in too much detail. I don't think it comes back all the time that games are a very particular type of community that's hard for people to get into for many different reasons. So yeah, when we're talking about a digital native, it sounds like we're talking about everyone in this circle in this generation, but we're actually describing a very, very specific person. And again, if we start reshaping all of our educational processes and the way we structure schools and fund them, then it will benefit this person greatly, of course, which is good for them, I guess. But it will, well, at best, just like not benefit other students as much, but at worst, really like hamper their actual educational opportunities and their experiences. So I will say this, like for a way better overview of this, that's way more in-depth than what I could give here. These are two of my kind of favorite entry papers for this kind of discussion. It's the myths of the digital native and the multitasker, written by someone in the teaching and teacher education community, which I think is very, very useful. It's someone outside of the game-based learning community writing about it. It's someone outside of the European Conference of Game-Based Learning writing about it, which again, I think is very useful. It can become a bit of an echo chamber otherwise. And then also the second paper is Digital Natives 10 years after. So this one was written, again, 10 years after Prensky's first publication of the digital natives text. So these two together, I think, provide a really cool overview of the journey of how digital natives as a concept has evolved over time. And of course, fundamentally, like at least read this one. I think it's just a good read overall. I think it's a great read, even if you haven't encountered the concept very much or don't use it at all yourself, which is not unreasonable to do. I think looking at this kind of helps you kind of sharpen yourself as an academic a little bit and be better at like identifying what kind of language and writing you should be careful of. And I actually do want to conclude on that too, because I have talked about similar things in conferences before, not in this much detail, I don't think. And sometimes this kind of awkward situation happens when people presenting after me or something like that, or before me, has used Prensky in their maybe their submission to the proceedings or in their actual presentation. And for those people, I just want to say that there's no problem with that at all. It would almost be very weird if you didn't include it, if it wasn't specifically in this kind of critical paper, because if you didn't include it, you would completely look like you had done none of your fundamental reading. The major problem is that this has become fundamental reading by people decades before you, and it's just natural to kind of bounce things off of them. And yeah, so I never fault someone for actually using it, but maybe in the future you'll be more careful and do it. Cool. I think this is close to the 30-minute mark, so I won't go into the practicalities, but again, you can look at my paper. So thank you very much, and I apologize for the noise again.
Thank you so much. Well, I would say that was quite amazing, and for my part, I would even say that it was quite mind-blowing, because I think you are pointing out something in the field of game technology that is not just about game technologies. I think for I'm pretty sure in all the fields there's a gap between the amount of publication that you are able to reach and that you might cite without really knowing what you are talking about. You read the abstract, you read the conclusion, the figures were nice. Okay, I can cite that for sure. I must confess that I did this. Yeah, that's very true. I also did this because there's no time left. So how do you manage from your point of view when you make a paper and it's good to have 40 papers in your references?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Like I think if you read my early, maybe the first 3 or 4 years when I was publishing serious game stuff, like I'm sure I used Prensky in that specific way, just as you said, like you read an abstract or something. Or again, if you read 15 other papers about digital game-based learning and all 15 do include Prensky saying the same thing, you do feel kind of confident in saying, oh, I probably don't have to look at that too closely. So many people agree on it already that it's fine. I don't know, it becomes like you don't have time to sit down and question gravity every time you're doing like physics homework or something like that. You kind of have to progress and kind of move forward. And that's kind of what this feels like, I think. And especially as a junior researcher, that was my experience, definitely.
Is there some questions in the audience? Yes, a question here?
I agree very strongly. I always catch my students on citing stuff that's from archive or books. And we know books are very often not peer-reviewed. So I would say it's a thing that I see all the time.
Have you heard the question, or do you want me to
repeat? Yes. And yeah, no, that's a great point. Like citing books in general is incredibly complicated because the peer reviewing process is often very hidden, as you said. It's kind of unclear on exactly how it was made, especially if it's an anthology with 5 or 10 chapters in it. It's very hard to see what the individual chapters have gone through. And that's why I used my librarians to kind of do that check for me. Again, they pointed out that the book chapter itself had no references whatsoever. But I will also say that it becomes incredibly complicated because Mark Prensky also published the Digital Native Part 1 and 2 in a journal, a different journal. So there's so many versions of it available. And yeah, it's very hard to trace. But yeah, no, I think it's good that you do what you do, kind of caution your students to be careful, especially with maybe books, stuff like that.
Another question, maybe? Yes, Mela?
Thank you very much, Björn, for this insightful talk. I also think even if some audits are peer review because it's not a guarantee of quality, because those peers may also have read or Googled the same sources. They also don't know all the auditors or have looked on the second or third page on a Google search. I think this is a great call for going on a further page of Google research.
Have you heard the remark? So
I heard that. I think. Oh, sorry, go. Thank you.
oh, the main point was from Mela from ZHDK in Zurich. She was pointing out that it was a very, very good remark to not just Google the first page and to seek for the second and third and look at what's going on there.
Yeah, no, no, I think that technique is really good. Like a technique I use is just to, and I do it. I think it's important to do it when a particular source keeps showing up all the time. You can't do it for every single. You just can't. We need to be realistic. You can't in-depth scrutinize every single reference you use. But if you start seeing the exact same one a million times, you really should start resorting to or looking at that particular thing. One thing I find to be efficient when doing that is to simply add the word critique, as a search term after, for example, digital native, because that's when all these kind of things start showing up and it becomes kind of interesting and a really quick way to get this broader overview, I would say. Because again, yeah, I really sympathize with, again, junior researchers are the ones that are very susceptible to it. They don't have the time to do this. Purely speaking, they don't have the time. And in many cases, the junior researchers that might not have developed the skill sets yet to do these kind of examinations. So for me, it's a problem that the senior academics in the field should be tackling very seriously.
Yes, it's
primarily.
That's very true. Another question, maybe, from the audience? I do have some questions. You point out that 10 years ago, around, there was an author who criticized, I would say, this comparison between native and immigrant stuff. And he said, well, what about 10 years later? If you had to make a publication 20 years later, so that you would criticize maybe the root publication, and also the second part, the 10 years later, at the same time. What would you say?
I think, because I feel like papers like these do a way better scientific breakdown of the flaws in thinking about the digital native's brain. That's completely, they've done that really, really well, better than I can. One thing I can do is talk about it from the perspective of a game designer and a game developer. I like talking about it again from a kind of practical perspective, like looking at what kind of restructuring and new educational movements and purchases schools do based on these assumptions, what that leads to in the end, what that leads to for game developers or for teachers and that or for students where I do a lot of my work. So I think that's where I can add quite a bit to the conversation. My experiences as a game developer and that kind of stuff can help looking at those practical sides of it. And it's a very efficient way to point out the complete mismatch between a lot of game development and game design thinking and the realities of how game or education and students actually work. Let's see, I feel like I had... Oh, that was a bad answer to your question, but I had maybe the next thing will show up in my head again.
Don't worry. My colleagues are pointing out that I will not be able to ask my many questions, so maybe I'll talk to you later on. Thank you so much again, and thank you especially when you said that you believe the GSGS was showing a kind of good way when we were trying to base our perspective on experience and practical. Thank you so much.